Hey there. Tonight we start by sinking our toes into the ancient sands of humanity's earliest attempts at lawmaking. The clay tablets and stone pillars, they carved their codes into might look impressive in museums. But trust me, if you lived under these laws, you probably wouldn't survive your first market day without committing at least 3 capital offenses. So, before you drift off completely, like this video and subscribe, only if this kind of sleepy narration is your thing. And hey, drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is on your end. Now, kill the overhead lights and let's get into some history. Imagine living in a world where stubbing your toe could be interpreted as an offense against the gods, where wearing the wrong colored sandals might get you executed, or where your payment for dental work could legally include your dentist's hand being cut off if they accidentally broke your tooth. Welcome to the bizarre legal landscape of ancient civilizations, where justice was often as strange as it was severe. We'll start in Mesopotamia, cradle of civilization and birthplace of some truly head-scratching legal concepts. The Code of Hammurabi, that famous 18-foot stone monument from around 1750 BCE, contained 282 laws that ranged from the sensible to the utterly baffling. While you might be familiar with its famous eye for an eye principle, did you know it also specified that if a son struck his father, the son's hands would be cut off? Harsh parenting techniques aside, Hammurabi's code had some fascinating quirks. For instance, if you were a surgeon in ancient Babylon and operated successfully on a nobleman, you'd receive 10 shekels of silver. But if your patient died or lost an eye during the procedure, they'd cut off your hands. I suppose that's one way to maintain high healthcare standards, though it does make you wonder how anyone ever became a doctor under such pressure. Imagine your first day of medical training. Welcome to surgeon school. If you make a mistake, we'll dismember you. Now, who's ready to practice? The code also specified that if a house collapsed and killed the owner, the builder of that house would be put to death. And if it killed the owner's son, well, the builder's son would be killed in return. Real estate development was apparently not a career you'd want your children to follow you into. Dad, what do you do for work? Oh, I build houses, son. By the way, you might want to start sleeping with one eye open. Moving eastward to ancient Egypt, their legal system had its own delightful peculiarities. For one, they had an interesting approach to courtroom testimony. Witnesses would sometimes be required to swear an oath while holding their genitals, a practice believed to invoke the gods of fertility as guarantors of truth. Nothing says, "I'm telling the whole truth," quite like cupping your private parts in a public forum. Imagine trying that in a modern courtroom. Please raise your right hand and grab your. Sir, please stop. We've updated our procedures. Egyptian law also took animal behavior very seriously. If your ox gored someone to death, both you and the ox would be put on trial. Yes, animals faced criminal proceedings in ancient Egypt. There are records of trials where pigs, oxen, and even insects were defendants, with court-appointed lawyers arguing their cases. I can just picture a frustrated attorney turning to his client. Look, Mr. Ox, your alibi isn't holding up. I need you to show some remorse for the jury. Try looking sad or mooing apologetically. Female pharaohs like Hatshepsut had to navigate peculiar legal waters as well. When she became ruler, Egyptian law required that official documents refer to her as a male, complete with the addition of a ceremonial false beard in statues and artwork. Imagine that job interview. Your qualifications are excellent. You'll make a fine pharaoh. Just one thing. How do you feel about being legally referred to as His Majesty and wearing a fake beard for the rest of your life? The ancient Greeks, those philosophical pioneers we credit with founding democracy, had their fair share of legal oddities too. In Athens, they practiced ostracism, where once-a-year citizens could vote to exile someone from the city for 10 years. No trial, no defense, just pure popularity contest in reverse. Citizens would scratch the name of the person they wanted gone on pottery shards called ostraka, and whoever won the most votes had to pack their sandals and leave. No crime needed to be committed. You could be ostracized for simply being annoying. Imagine being kicked out of your hometown because your neighbors found your laugh irritating, or you talked too much about CrossFit. And then there was Draco, the Athenian lawgiver, whose name gives us the term draconian. Around 621 BCE, he created Athens' first written legal code. And let's just say he wasn't big on proportionate punishment. According to Draco, the penalty for practically everything, from murder to stealing a cabbage, was death. When asked why he assigned capital punishment for minor offenses, he reportedly said the small crimes deserved death, and he couldn't think of anything worse for the major ones. Talk about lacking imagination. You stepped on my foot. Death. You borrowed my chariot without asking. Death. You overcooked the lamb at dinner. Believe it or not, also death. Sparta, Athens' militaristic rival, had some truly bizarre laws around child rearing. When a child was born, it would be examined by elders, and if deemed unhealthy or deformed, it would be abandoned on a hillside to die of exposure. Those who survived this initial screening faced a childhood of legally mandated hardship. Boys were taken from their families at age 7 to begin military training, where they were deliberately underfed to encourage stealing. But if caught stealing, they were severely punished. The lesson wasn't don't steal, but rather don't get caught. Spartan career guidance was essentially be an excellent warrior or die trying. Also, there are no other career options. One of my favorite weird ancient Greek laws comes from the island of Thassos, where a law prohibited women from looking out of their windows during certain hours. The punishment: a public announcement naming and shaming them as adulterers, regardless of whether any adultery had actually occurred. Imagine the town crier wandering through the streets. Hear ye, hear ye. Sophia from Olive Street looked out her window at dusk. She's definitely up to something scandalous, even though we have no evidence whatsoever. But perhaps the strangest law from ancient Greece comes from the city of Locri, where according to the lawgiver Zaleucus, Anyone proposing a new law had to do so with a noose around their neck. If the proposal was rejected, they would be immediately hanged. That's certainly one way to cut down on frivolous legislation. I move that we establish a weekly garbage collection. Wait, why are you tightening that rope? Can we discuss this? The ancient Persians had an interesting twist on judicial matters as well. According to Herodotus, when someone was brought to trial, the judges would consider not just the specific crime alleged, but the entirety of the person's life, all their good and bad deeds, before rendering judgment. In theory, a lifetime of good acts could save you from punishment for a single bad one. Yes, I did steal that goat, but remember when I saved those children from the flood 20 years ago? And I always help my neighbor with his harvest. And I haven't murdered anyone in at least 3 decades. Among the ancient Hittites of Anatolia, we find laws that assigned monetary values to body parts as compensation for injuries. A tooth might cost you 3 shekels, an ear 12 shekels, and so on. They essentially created the world's first bodily injury price list. But bizarrely, the penalties were often reduced if the victim was a slave, or doubled if the victim was pregnant. I imagine Hittite children learning this strange math. If you break someone's finger, that's 4 shekels. If they're pregnant, that's 8 shekels. If they're a pregnant slave, divide by 2, then multiply by. Actually, just try not to break anyone's anything. As we drift away from the ancient world, let's pause to appreciate how these early legal systems, for all their oddities, laid the groundwork for everything that followed. Their clay tablets and stone pillars, their ruthless punishments and peculiar prohibitions, all represented humanity's first fumbling attempts to create order from chaos, to establish some kind of predictable justice in an unpredictable world. And if that meant putting a few oxen on trial, or making surgeons literally risk life and limb with every procedure, well, nobody ever said the path to modern jurisprudence would be straightforward. As we leave behind the peculiar laws of the most ancient civilizations, we find ourselves strolling down the immaculately paved roads of the Roman Empire, where regulation reached an art form previously unknown to humanity. The Romans, those masters of military conquest, civil engineering, and bureaucratic micromanagement, established one of history's most comprehensive legal systems, and with it, some truly baffling prohibitions that would make even the most zealous modern regulator blush. The Romans gave us the concept of corpus juris civilis, a body of civil law that forms the foundation of many modern legal systems. But alongside principles we still hold dear today, they developed some regulations that were, shall we say, uniquely Roman in their preoccupations. For instance, while you were enjoying your meal at a Roman dinner party, you needed to be careful about how often you visited the vomitorium. Contrary to popular belief, these weren't rooms designed specifically for purging after overindulgence. They were simply exits from amphitheaters. However, actual vomiting at banquets was common enough that Emperor Claudius felt compelled to pass a law regulating it. The law permitted vomiting to make room for more food, a charming dining custom, but only if you did it discreetly. Violating the proper vomiting etiquette could result in social ostracism or even fines. "Excuse me, sir, you're facing the wrong direction while evacuating your stomach contents. That'll be 5 denarii. Speaking of dining, the Romans were positively obsessed with regulating food consumption. In 161 BCE, the Lex Fania was passed, limiting how much could be spent on dinner parties and restricting the types of food that could be served. Only 1 hen was permitted per meal, and it couldn't be artificially fattened, a dire blow to the ancient equivalent of fast food. The law even specified how many dried vegetables could accompany a meal. Imagine the dinner party conversations. "This soup is divine, Quintus. Thank you, but I must confess, there's a forbidden 3rd lentil hidden at the bottom. Please don't report me to the ediles." Excessive luxury was a particular target of Roman legislators. The Lex Appia, passed during the crisis of the Second Punic War, prohibited women from owning more than half an ounce of gold, wearing multicolored garments, or riding in a carriage within a mile of the city, except during religious festivals. When the war ended and prosperity returned, Roman women took to the streets in one of history's first recorded women's protests, demanding the repeal of these restrictions. After much debate in the Senate, the law was overturned, marking an early victory for consumer rights and fashion freedom. "You can take our lands, you can take our slaves, but you'll never take our multicolored garments." The Romans were also deeply concerned with maintaining proper social distinctions, and clothing was a primary battlefield for this obsession. The use of Tyrian purple dye, made from thousands of crushed murex sea snails, was strictly regulated. At various times, only the emperor could wear a fully purple toga, with lesser officials permitted progressively smaller purple stripes, according to their rank. The punishment for a commoner dressing above their station could be severe, sometimes even death. Imagine being executed for a fashion faux pas, though, I suppose, in some modern fashion circles, wearing the wrong shade is still considered a capital offense. Marriage and reproduction were subject to extensive legal tinkering as well. Emperor Augustus, concerned about declining birth rates among the upper classes, passed the Lex Julia et Papia Papia, which penalized unmarried adults and childless couples while rewarding those who produced multiple offspring. Men between 25 and 60 and women between 20 and 50 faced higher taxes and limits on inheritance if they remained unmarried or childless. Meanwhile, a father of 3 children in Rome, or 4 in Italy, or 5 in the provinces, received various legal privileges, including priority for government positions. The law created a bizarre social dynamic where the childless wealthy would sometimes adopt grown men just before death to avoid inheritance penalties. "Congratulations, Marcus, you're my son now. I'm dying tomorrow, by the way. Enjoy the villa. Julius Caesar, never one for half measures, tackled Rome's traffic problems with characteristic decisiveness. He banned all wheeled vehicles from the city center during daylight hours, with exceptions only for construction materials, Vestal virgins, certain priests, and triumphant generals. Everyone else had to conduct their business on foot, carry their goods, or wait until nightfall, when, of course, the streets became a chaotic free-for-all of carts, wagons, and chariots, all making deliveries simultaneously. The resulting noise was so disruptive that another law was eventually passed limiting nighttime commercial transport. The Romans had effectively invented both daytime congestion charges and nighttime noise ordinances, trapping merchants in an impossible regulatory bind that would make modern delivery drivers weep with recognition. Public behavior was another arena for oddly specific legislation. A law under Emperor Domitian prohibited people from greeting him without first cleaning their hands. One can only imagine the scene. "Hail, mighty Caesar. I bring news from, have you washed your hands?" Yes, divine one, just before, prove it. Smell test. Now, the practice of kissing, too, fell under imperial regulation. Emperor Tiberius attempted to ban public kissing entirely due to concerns about the spread of a facial skin disease. When this proved unenforceable, Romans were, apparently, quite affectionate. The rules were modified to permit kissing only between family members or on special occasions. Enforcement required witnesses to verify the relationship between kissers, creating a bizarre situation where couples might need to carry family trees to defend their public displays of affection. "Officer, I can explain. She's my third cousin twice removed on my mother's side. I have a diagram right here." Even artistic expression wasn't safe from Roman regulatory zeal. Nero, that infamous imperial arsonist and fiddler, passed laws requiring audiences to remain in the theater for the entirety of his musical performances. Guards were stationed at the doors to prevent escape, and there are accounts of women giving birth during particularly lengthy imperial recitals because they weren't permitted to leave. Some desperate spectators reportedly feigned death to be carried out. Imagine the conversation. Is he really dead? No, but he will be if he has to listen to another one of Nero's compositions. Public toilets, those great Roman innovations, came with their own peculiar regulations. Since many Roman latrines were communal affairs, with stone benches featuring round holes positioned side by side, rules of etiquette were established and sometimes enforced by law. One prohibited the reading of poetry in public toilets, apparently a common enough practice to warrant legislation. Picture the scene. A row of toga-clad Romans seated in close proximity, when suddenly one pulls out a scroll. "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. Excuse me, sir. There's no poetry allowed during defecation. Save your dactylic hexameter for the forum. Gambling, a popular Roman pastime, faced a complex web of regulations. Games of chance were generally forbidden, except during the festival of Saturnalia in December. However, betting on physical competitions like chariot racing was permitted year-round. This created the bizarre situation where dice games were illegal in January, but perfectly acceptable a few weeks earlier. Law enforcement was predictably uneven, with wealthy Romans hosting illegal gambling parties with little consequence, while poor street gamblers faced harsh penalties. Some things, it seems, never change across the millennia, and burial practices weren't exempt from Roman regulatory attention either. The 12 Tables, Rome's earliest written legal code, included prohibitions against burying or cremating bodies within the city limits, a reasonable public health measure. Less reasonable was the law limiting funeral expenses and displays of grief. Women were forbidden from tearing their cheeks with their nails to draw blood in mourning, and restrictions were placed on the number of musicians who could perform at funerals. You could only hire 3 mourners to play the funeral flute, and they couldn't play just any sad tune. Specific funeral dirges were prescribed by law. I'm sorry, madam, but that's clearly a fourth flautist hiding behind the monument. And is he playing something in the Lydian mode? The penalty for incorrect funeral music is 10 denarii. As the Roman Empire expanded across 3 continents, its legal peculiarities spread as well, creating situations where local customs collided with Roman law in ways both comical and confusing. In Egypt, for example, crocodiles had been worshipped as divine for centuries, but Roman law classified them as dangerous vermin to be exterminated. The resulting theological and legal confusion created a regulatory nightmare that persisted for generations. And so, as the roads of Roman law lead us inevitably toward the Middle Ages, we can appreciate how this empire of order paradoxically created some of history's most amusingly disordered legal situations. Their obsession with regulating every aspect of daily life, from vomiting protocol to funeral music, suggests that perhaps the more laws a civilization creates, the more absurdity inevitably creeps in. A lesson our modern lawmakers might do well to consider. As the Roman Empire crumbled into history, Europe descended into what we now call, with a certain academic smugness, the medieval period. But don't let the fancy terminology fool you. This was an era when the average European peasant's life was governed by a patchwork quilt of overlapping authorities, each with their own increasingly bizarre legal codes. If you thought Hammurabi was harsh or Roman regulations were fussy, medieval European law will make you wonder how anyone survived to adulthood without running afoul of some obscure statute that could cost them their livestock, limbs, or lives. The feudal system that dominated medieval Europe created a legal maze where your obligations and rights depended on who owned the land you stood upon, which lord you served, which guild you belonged to, and whether it was a Tuesday during Lent or a Thursday after Pentecost. You could literally walk 5 miles down the road and find yourself under an entirely different set of laws. Imagine explaining that to a confused traveler. Oh yes, in this village you can't wear pointed shoes, but once you cross that stream over there, pointed shoes are fine, but blue hats are punishable by flogging. Watch your headwear accordingly. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of medieval law was its preoccupation with animals. We've already touched on animal trials in ancient Egypt, but medieval Europeans elevated this practice to an art form. Across the continent, animals were routinely put on trial for various offenses, with full legal proceedings, including defense attorneys, prosecutors, judges, and sometimes juries. A famous case from 1457 saw a sow and her 6 piglets tried for murdering and partially eating a 5-year-old boy in Savigny, France. The sow was found guilty and executed by hanging. The piglets were initially condemned to death as well, but their sentence was later commuted due to their youth and the bad example set by their mother. Yes, medieval courts actually considered the corrupting parental influence of criminal pigs. Insects weren't exempt from legal proceedings either. In 1545, wine growers in St. Julian brought a lawsuit against weevils for damaging their vineyards. The insects were assigned a defense lawyer who argued so persuasively that the court ordered the humans to create an alternative feeding ground for the pests. When the weevils continued eating the valuable vines instead of relocating to their designated area, they were excommunicated from the church. I'm sure the weevils were devastated by this spiritual punishment as they continued their merry feasting. Medieval Europe was also obsessed with regulating clothing, particularly to maintain clear visual distinctions between social classes. Sumptuary laws dictated who could wear what colors, fabrics, and styles. In 14th century England, only royalty could wear purple, while ermine trim was reserved for nobles of specific ranks. Merchants, no matter how wealthy, were forbidden from wearing gold or silver cloth. The most successful businessmen in town might have more actual coins than the local baron, but heaven forbid they dress like it. These clothing regulations extended to the most intimate details, quite literally. In 15th century Florence, prostitutes were required by law to wear gloves, bells on their hats, and high-heeled slippers. Meanwhile, in parts of Germany, they had to wear red capes or yellow scarves for easy identification. The reasoning went beyond simple moral posturing. It was to ensure that respectable men wouldn't accidentally proposition an honest woman. My deepest apologies, madam. I noticed you weren't wearing the legally mandated jingly hat of shame, so I had no way of knowing you were a married noblewoman rather than a lady of negotiable affection. Speaking of sexual matters, medieval bedrooms were surprisingly subject to legal oversight. Church courts regulated when you could have sex with your spouse, prohibiting intimacy on Sundays, holy days, during Lent, Advent, while your wife was pregnant, and for 40 days after she gave birth. When you add it all up, married couples were legally permitted to have sex fewer than half the days of the year. Given the famously large families of the medieval period, one suspects this was among the most widely ignored laws in history. The church's legal influence extended far beyond the bedroom. In many regions, it was illegal to skip Sunday Mass without a legitimate excuse. Punishments could include fines, public penance, or in repeated cases, being suspected of heresy, which was decidedly not something you wanted in an era fond of burning heretics. Missing church to sleep in after a night at the tavern could literally put your life at risk. "Sorry I'm late, Father. My ox was feeling poorly," became medieval Europe's version of "my dog ate my homework." Medieval guilds added another layer of bewildering regulations. These professional associations controlled who could practice particular trades, and they took their monopolies very seriously. Guild regulations specified everything from what materials could be used to what hours work could be performed. In some cities, bakers were forbidden from baking at night because the light from their ovens might be mistaken for fires and cause panic. In others, guild rules prohibited innovation. Yes, you read that correctly, to prevent any member from gaining a competitive advantage. Imagine being fined for being too good at your job. You've developed a more efficient loom. How dare you? That'll be 5 shillings and a public apology to your fellow weavers for your dangerous creativity. Perhaps the most head-scratching medieval laws concerned food production. In 1066, England's forests were declared the property of the king, and a complex set of forest laws emerged to govern them. Hunting deer was punishable by blinding. Cutting down trees could result in dismemberment. Even gathering fallen branches for firewood could lead to severe penalties. These weren't merely property laws. They took on an almost religious quality. The king's deer became sacred beings, more legally protected than most humans. Starvation and hypothermia were apparently preferable to the cardinal sin of warming your peasant hovel with royal timber. Bread, that most basic staple of medieval life, was subject to particularly stringent regulation. The assize of bread, established in England in 1266, set the legal weight of loaves according to the price of grain. Bakers found selling underweight bread faced progressive penalties. First offense, a fine; second offense, the pillory; third offense, having their ovens destroyed; fourth offense, being expelled from the town entirely. The law was so strict that bakers developed the practice of adding a 13th loaf to every dozen sold, the original baker's dozen, as insurance against accusations of short measure. "Here's your bread, sir, with an extra loaf thrown in, so I don't end up homeless when your scale inevitably differs from the sheriff's." Medical practice in medieval Europe was also subject to bizarre legal restrictions. In many areas, surgeons and barbers were governed by the same guild regulations, leading to the familiar red and white barber pole that originally signified both bloodletting and haircuts, services often provided by the same practitioner. In some regions, the law prohibited surgeons from extracting bladder stones, reserving that particular joy for specialized stonecutters. These practitioners would travel from town to town, operating on sufferers for hefty fees, with no follow-up care. It's hard to imagine a more terrifying business model. Hold still while I cut into your most sensitive area. If you survive, I'll be 3 towns over by the time infection sets in. Good luck. Medieval justice had a particular fondness for creative punishments tailored to the crime. Bakers who sold short measure might be dragged through town on a sled, with the offending loaf tied around their neck. Cheating brewers could be forced to drink their own adulterated beer until they became ill. Gossips and scolds might be subjected to the ducking stool, repeatedly dunked in the local river or pond. The scold's bridle, a metal cage fitted over a woman's head with a plate that pressed down on her tongue, was a legally sanctioned punishment for women deemed too argumentative. One can only imagine the medieval husband explaining this punishment to his wife after she recovered. Look, darling, it wasn't my idea. It's just the law that if you criticize my drinking habits in public, they get to lock your head in an iron cage. Take it up with the magistrate. Perhaps the strangest aspect of medieval legal systems was their obsession with supernatural proof. Trial by ordeal was widely practiced, based on the belief that God would protect the innocent. Accused persons might be forced to carry red-hot iron, retrieve stones from boiling water, or be bound and thrown into a pond. Floating meant you were guilty. Sinking meant you were innocent, though possibly also dead from drowning, unless quickly retrieved. These ordeals weren't extrajudicial torture. They were the legal system itself, codified and administered by officials. Congratulations. Your degree burns have legally proven your innocence. You're free to go, assuming you survive the infection. Equally bizarre was the practice of corsand, where the accused would be given a piece of dry bread and cheese, blessed by a priest. If they choked while eating it, which seems rather likely given the stress of the situation and the dryness of the bread, this was considered proof of guilt. Medieval courts basically turned "I almost choked on my sandwich" into evidence of criminal behavior. As we leave behind the bewildering legal landscape of medieval Europe, with its criminal pigs, regulated bedrooms, and supernatural bread tests, we might feel a certain superiority from our modern vantage point. But before we get too comfortable, remember that many of these laws remained on the books for centuries, with some medieval statutes still technically enforceable well into the modern era. The human impulse to regulate every aspect of each other's lives didn't end with the Middle Ages. It just found new and equally absurd expressions, as we'll soon discover, leaving the peculiar legal worlds of the common medieval folk behind. We now ascend the marble steps to the ornate halls of power, where kings, queens, and emperors exercised their divine right to create some of history's most bafflingly ridiculous laws, while the peasantry suffered under local regulations about baking bread and wearing bells. The crowned heads of Europe and beyond were busy crafting legal monuments to their own eccentricities, paranoia, and occasional outright madness. Absolute power, it seems, absolutely guaranteed legal absurdity. Perhaps no monarch better exemplifies the bizarre intersection of power and legal caprice than England's King Henry VIII. Beyond his marital adventures, Henry's legal proclamations often reflected his personal obsessions. Take his 1541 Unlawful Games Act, which made it illegal for commoners to play tennis, dice, cards, bowls, and other games, except during the 12 days of Christmas. The law specifically exempted the nobility, of course. Henry himself was an avid tennis player and apparently couldn't bear the thought of some talented commoner becoming better at his favorite sport than he was. Your Majesty, there's a blacksmith in Essex with a remarkable backhand. Make it illegal immediately. Only I may serve with such magnificence. Even more revealing of Henry's character was his 1542 law regarding royal food. After becoming increasingly paranoid about assassination attempts, he declared it high treason, punishable by death to imagine or wish harm to the king. This was extended to include poisoning, making it a capital offense to cook for the king without official permission. One wrong spice in the royal pudding, and it was off to the tower with you. Kitchen staff must have drawn straws to determine who had the dubious honor of serving the king his daily meals. Congratulations, Thomas. You've been selected to present His Majesty's breakfast. Be sure to taste everything first, and may God have mercy on your soul if he detects too much salt. Henry's daughter Elizabeth I inherited her father's flair for peculiar proclamations. Concerned about the growing population of London and the resulting strain on resources, she issued a proclamation in 1580 forbidding any new buildings within 3 miles of London's gates and prohibiting multiple families from occupying a single house. The penalty for violation included seizure of materials and imprisonment. As you might imagine, this did absolutely nothing to stem the city's growth, but it did create a thriving black market in urban housing and construction. Psst. Want to buy some illegal bricks? I know a guy who can add a room to your house under cover of darkness. Not to be outdone by the English, French monarchs had their own obsessions codified into law. King Louis XIV, the Sun King, was particularly concerned with the nobility spending too much time in Paris rather than attending him at Versailles. To solve this problem, he issued a royal edict in 1673 determining exactly which nobles were permitted to use carriages with glass windows in Paris. Those out of favor had to make do with oiled cloth or nothing at all. Imagine being a duke or duchess, shivering in an open carriage during a Parisian winter, all because you missed one too many of the king's elaborate parties. Yes, I'm a prince of the blood, but apparently I didn't laugh enthusiastically enough at His Majesty's jokes last month, so now I have to ride through Paris in what is essentially a wheelbarrow with horses. Louis XIV also issued a bizarre series of edicts attempting to control fashion, particularly lace. At one point, he made it illegal for anyone other than himself to wear a specific style of lace cuffs. When this proved too difficult to enforce, he eventually established a royal lace factory to ensure he had exclusive access to the finest styles. The Sun King literally created an industrial facility to protect his monopoly on fancy sleeves. Am I detecting unauthorized lace on your wrists, Monsieur le Comte? Prepare to face the full force of royal justice. His successor, Louis XV, continued the tradition of strange royal proclamations. Bored with traditional Christmas celebrations, he issued an edict in 1735 banning the traditional Yule log ceremony throughout France. His reasoning: he found it provincial and lacking in sophistication. Thousands of families had to abandon centuries of tradition because one man found their holiday customs insufficiently elegant. I regret to inform you, children, that we cannot have our traditional Yule log this year. The king has determined our family traditions are too rustic for his refined sensibilities. Russian tsars were particularly prolific in producing bizarre legal proclamations. Peter the Great, determined to modernize Russia, issued his infamous beard tax in 1698. After returning from a tour of Western Europe, Peter was convinced that facial hair was holding Russia back from becoming a modern power. All men except priests and peasants were required to shave their beards or pay a special tax. Those who paid received a copper token bearing the phrase, "The beard is a superfluous burden," that they were required to carry at all times. Halt, citizen. Present your beard license immediately, or prepare for an involuntary shaving. Not content with regulating facial hair, Peter also took aim at clothing. He mandated Western European styles for the Russian nobility and urban dwellers, banning traditional Russian garments like the long-sleeved robes and kaftan. Guards were stationed at city gates to ensure compliance, with orders to either collect fines or literally cut the offending garments to knee length on the spot. Imagine arriving at Moscow after a long journey, only to have a government official take scissors to your clothes before you're allowed to enter the city. Welcome to Moscow. Please stand still while I transform your family heirloom coat into the latest fashion from the Netherlands. Catherine the Great, not to be outdone, issued a decree in 1775 prohibiting any commoner from wearing red, which she had declared a royal color. This didn't just apply to clothing, but extended to house paint, carriage decoration, and even garden flowers. There are accounts of imperial guards uprooting red tulips from middle-class gardens for violating this proclamation. I'm sorry about your prize-winning roses, madam, but they're displaying treasonous coloration. Step aside while we confiscate these rebellious blooms. In the Ottoman Empire, Sultan Murad IV developed a particular hatred for coffee and tobacco, both relatively new introductions to his empire. He declared both substances illegal, with the penalty being death. Not content to let his guards enforce this law, Murad would disguise himself and wander the streets of Istanbul at night. When he caught someone smoking or drinking coffee, he would personally execute them on the spot. Imagine enjoying a quiet evening pipe, only to discover that the imposing stranger who just entered your coffee house was actually your homicidal monarch. Lovely evening for a oh no. Is that the Sultan with a sword? And I'm holding a coffee cup. How unfortunate. King Charles II of Spain issued perhaps history's most bizarre royal proclamation regarding personal hygiene. In 1654, he declared it illegal for anyone to bathe without a doctor's prescription. The exact reasoning behind this law remains murky, but it may have stemmed from the belief that open pores from bathing made one vulnerable to illness. Whatever the logic, the result was that the Spanish court became notorious throughout Europe for its powerful aroma. Foreign ambassadors would write home about the overwhelming experience of royal audiences in Madrid. The king's new proclamation against bathing has made diplomatic functions a true test of endurance. I've taken to discreetly holding a pomander to my nose during state dinners, though I fear this may constitute lèse-majesté. Emperor Hongwu, founder of China's Ming dynasty, created an elaborate legal code that included spectacularly cruel punishments for seemingly minor offenses. One of his stranger edicts concerned the mixing of different types of domestic animals. Anyone found keeping cattle, horses, donkeys, mules, camels, or goats together in the same enclosure could be sentenced to receiving 100 strokes of a bamboo cane. The imperial rationale suggested that mixing animals was contrary to the natural order. One can only imagine the panic of a farmer realizing his goat had wandered into the horse pen. Quickly, children, separate the animals before the imperial inspector arrives, or father will be beaten senseless. Japan's Tokugawa shoguns, while technically not monarchs, exercised similar absolute power and created equally bizarre legal structures. During Japan's period of isolation, Tokugawa Iemitsu issued edicts in the 1630s, making it illegal for Japanese citizens to leave Japan. The penalty for violation was death. Even more strangely, if a Japanese citizen who had left the country somehow returned, they would also be executed. It was literally illegal to come home. Welcome back after your foreign adventures. As punishment for returning to your homeland, you will now be executed. Many apologies for the inconvenience. The shogunate also regulated clothing with obsessive detail. Different colors, fabrics, and styles were prescribed for each social class. A merchant, no matter how wealthy, could not legally wear silk. A particularly odd regulation prohibited anyone from wearing brighter colors than the people socially ranked above them. This created the surreal situation where people would carry color swatches to ensure their kimonos weren't illegally vibrant. I'm sorry, Hiroshi, but that shade of blue is at least 2 brightness levels above what's permitted for a person of your station. Please change into something more appropriately dull. Danish King Christian IV took royal legal oddities in a different direction. Rather than focusing on his subjects, he created laws governing his own behavior, specifically his drinking habits. After several embarrassing incidents while intoxicated, he created a position called the Royal Drinking Companion, whose legal duty was to match the king drink for drink, while remaining sober enough to prevent the monarch from making disastrous decisions. The job came with a substantial salary, but high risk, as several holders of the office died from alcohol-related illnesses. Congratulations on your appointment to the royal court. Your job is to drink yourself to death slightly slower than His Majesty. As we close this tour of royal legal absurdity, perhaps the most telling example comes from Emperor Caligula of Rome, who, in a fit of either madness or trolling, had his tax laws written in tiny letters on tablets posted high on columns. This made them virtually impossible to read, yet citizens were still required to obey them or face severe penalties. This might be the perfect metaphor for how monarchs throughout history have viewed law, not as a system of justice, but as a tool of power to be wielded arbitrarily and sometimes bizarrely according to personal whim. And so we leave behind the perfumed halls of royal power, where wearing the wrong lace could be treason and owning a beard required a license. The proclamations of kings and emperors remind us that no amount of divine right can protect humanity from legal absurdity. In fact, absolute power seems to guarantee it. As we move forward, we'll see how these royal traditions of legal peculiarity found fertile ground in new soil across the Atlantic, where colonial legislators would prove just as creative in their legal oddities as European powers stretched their imperial ambitions across the Atlantic Ocean. They brought with them not just their languages, religions, and prejudices, but also their peculiar approaches to lawmaking. The colonial Americas became a fascinating legal laboratory where old world concepts collided with new world realities, creating a perfect storm of bizarre legislation. From the ice-bound settlements of New England to the tropical plantations of Brazil, colonial lawmakers outdid themselves in creating rules that ranged from the merely odd to the spectacularly irrational. No discussion of colonial legal oddities would be complete without addressing the elephant, or rather, the witch in the room. The Puritans who settled New England brought with them a particularly rigid worldview that saw Satan's influence lurking behind every stumble and sneeze. This paranoia reached its peak in the infamous Salem witch trials of 1692-93, but the legal framework for prosecuting witchcraft had been established decades earlier. Connecticut's Code of 1650 stated, "If any man or woman be a witch, that is, hath or consulteth with a familiar spirit, they shall be put to death. The evidence required for such a conviction would make modern legal scholars choke on their coffee. Courts accepted spectral evidence, testimony that the accused spirit or shape had visited victims in dreams or visions, as legitimate proof. Imagine trying that defense today. Your Honor, I couldn't possibly have stolen those chickens. The witness only saw my spectral form doing it while she was asleep. Massachusetts took witch hunting to even more creative legal extremes. Their 1641 body of liberties included fellowship with a familiar spirit among capital crimes, right alongside murder and arson. The colony's legal experts developed elaborate tests for identifying witches, including the infamous touch test. If a victim's fits stopped when touched by the suspected witch, this was considered proof of guilt rather than innocence. The logic, if you can call it that, was that the touch allowed the evil power to flow back to its source. It was quite literally a no-win situation. If you didn't stop the fits, you were guilty. If you did stop them, you were also guilty. Would you prefer to be hanged for failing the test or for passing it? Beyond witchcraft, the Puritans' legal codes regulated virtually every aspect of daily life with obsessive detail. The Massachusetts Bay Colony prohibited not just working on the Sabbath, but also unnecessary and unreasonable walking in the streets or fields on Sunday. One unfortunate colonist, Captain Kemble, was placed in the stocks for 2 hours for the crime of kissing his wife in public on the Sabbath after returning from a 3-year sea voyage. Apparently, his joy at being reunited with his spouse should have been contained to the privacy of their home. 3 years at sea, facing pirates and scurvy, and now I'm punished for kissing my own wife. I should have stayed with the sharks. They're less judgmental. Connecticut's blue laws were particularly imaginative. The colony prohibited mothers from kissing their children on the Sabbath, fined people for running on Sundays, and made it illegal to make mince pies, dance, play cards, or play any instrument except the drum, trumpet, or Jew's harp. This last exception presumably existed for military purposes, though one wonders what sort of emergency would require an immediate Jew's harp response. Quick, sound the Jew's harp. The British are coming. Perhaps the most absurd Puritan law-concerned fashion. In 1651, Massachusetts passed a law prohibiting excessive apparel among those who could not afford it. The statute specifically targeted gold or silver lace, buttons, points at their knees, or walking with great boots. Enforcement fell to local selectmen, who were required to assess each citizen's wealth and determine whether their clothing exceeded their social station. Those found guilty faced a fine of 10 shillings, ironically forcing them to become even less able to afford their fancy attire. Those boots look awfully grand for a man of your means, Goodman Johnson. That'll be 10 shillings for the crime of looking wealthier than you are. Virginia and other southern colonies developed their own peculiar legal traditions, many revolving around the maintenance of racial hierarchies and the institution of slavery. Less discussed, however, are the bizarrely specific laws that had nothing to do with these overarching systems. For instance, Virginia passed a law in 1619 requiring all citizens to attend church and bring their weapons with them. The fine for missing church was steep, but attending without your musket or sword could cost you twice as much. Welcome to Sunday service, Brother Williams. I see you've brought your Bible, but where is your blunderbuss? That'll be 50 pounds of tobacco, please. The same colony enacted a law in 1658, making it illegal to spread false news that might disturb the colony, with punishment set at riding wooden rails for 1 hour and paying a fine. Riding wooden rails involved being forced to straddle a wooden fence rail carried by others, resulting in extreme discomfort in sensitive areas. Imagine receiving this punishment for the colonial equivalent of sharing an unverified story on social media. I just mentioned that the governor might be considering new taxes. Was an hour of genital torture really necessary? In colonial Brazil, the Portuguese authorities created peculiar laws around gold mining. After discovering vast gold deposits in Minas Gerais in the late 17th century, they established a fifth tax, claiming 20% of all gold for the crown. To prevent smuggling, they made it illegal to open new roads without royal permission, a law that remained in effect even when existing roads became impassable due to flooding or landslides. Travelers faced a choice between breaking the law by creating a new path or becoming stranded. Sorry about your wagon being stuck in the mud for 3 weeks, but creating that detour path was an offense against His Majesty. Perhaps you should have waited for royal engineers to arrive from Lisbon. Spanish colonies had their own legal peculiarities. In colonial Mexico, the repartimiento de mercancías system legally compelled indigenous communities to purchase goods they didn't need or want from Spanish officials at inflated prices. Indigenous towns might suddenly find themselves forced to buy dozens of razors, despite traditionally wearing beards, or hundreds of pairs of silk stockings, despite going barefoot. Refusing these distributions was illegal and punishable by imprisonment. Congratulations, village of mostly fishermen. You're now the proud owners of 50 high-quality wool combs. No, you can't use them for fishing. Yes, you still have to pay for them. Back in British North America, the colony of Georgia initially banned both slavery and alcohol when it was founded in 1733. Progressive stances that unfortunately didn't last. Less progressive was the colony's strange law requiring every male to plant exactly 100 mulberry trees on every 10 acres of land they owned. The founder, James Oglethorpe, was convinced Georgia would become a major silk producer, despite the climate being completely wrong for silkworms. Colonists who failed to meet their mulberry quota faced significant fines. I know your crops are failing and your children are hungry, but have you considered how much the crown needs domestic silk production? plant those mulberries or face the consequences, colonial New York enacted a series of laws that might win the prize for most bafflingly specific. In 1678, it became illegal to gather oysters during the months of May, June, and July. This actually made environmental sense as a conservation measure, but the punishment was pure colonial overkill, a fine of 20 shillings and a mandatory public whipping of 39 lashes upon the bare back. Imagine suffering a brutal flogging for the crime of summer seafood collection. I just wanted some oysters for my July dinner party. Was the public torture really necessary? The same colony passed a law in 1665 requiring that all grain be weighed by an official public weigher before being ground at a mill. The weigher received a percentage of each batch, creating a bizarre legal form of grain theft that farmers simply had to accept. The law explicitly stated that anyone attempting to avoid this official weighing would forfeit their entire grain supply. Yes, I know it's your wheat that you grew on your land with your labor, but legally, I'm entitled to take some before you can make it into bread. Complain, and I'll take it all. Pennsylvania, despite its Quaker roots promoting tolerance, had its share of strange laws too. In 1700, the colony passed an act against conjuration, witchcraft, and dealing with evil and wicked spirits, which prescribed up to 1 year's imprisonment, not for being a witch, but for pretending to have occult powers. In essence, Pennsylvania made it illegal to be a fake witch, while implicitly acknowledging that real witches don't exist. A surprisingly rational position for the era, even if the law itself was odd. So you're not being charged with actually cursing Goodman Smith's cows, but rather with fraudulently claiming you could curse them. That'll be 6 months in prison for fake witchcraft. Colonial Maryland enacted perhaps the strangest speech law in American history. In 1637, a statute made it a crime to call someone certain specific insults, including hog, sow, dog, cur, fool, or any such like words of disgrace. However, the law didn't prohibit other creative insults, leading to an explosion of creative colonial cursing that technically remained legal. Colonists developed elaborate euphemisms and circumlocutions to express contempt while avoiding the specific banned terms. I would never call you a dog, good sir, as that would be illegal. I merely suggest you bear a striking resemblance to a 4-legged domestic canine with a tendency toward nocturnal vocalizations and indiscriminate consumption of comestibles. Rhode Island, founded on principles of religious freedom, still couldn't resist the colonial urge toward bizarre regulation. A 1719 law made it illegal to race horses on public highways, with an exemption granting special permission for racing on special occasions, but only if the horses were limited to walking pace speed. Yes, they legalized walking speed races, creating what must have been the world's most boring sporting events. And they're off, at a careful walk. Oh, the excitement. Smith's mare is maintaining a steady amble, while Johnson's stallion is proceeding at a dignified stroll. Perhaps the most telling colonial legal absurdity concerned relationships with Native Americans. Plymouth Colony enacted a law in 1636 that made it illegal to trade with Native Americans on Sundays. The statute didn't prohibit trade entirely, just on the Sabbath, revealing the peculiar colonial mindset that combined religious scruples with exploitative commerce. We can't possibly conduct business today. It's the Lord's day. Please come back tomorrow when we can resume the process of systematically appropriating your resources. As we leave behind the strange legal landscape of colonial America with its mandatory muskets at church, walking speed horse races, and public floggings for oyster gathering, we can see how these early legal frameworks laid the groundwork for the continuing American tradition of legislative peculiarity. The seeds planted in these colonial codes would bloom into full-fledged legal absurdity as the young nation matured, developing its own unique approaches to regulation that would have made even the most zealous Puritan magistrate raise an eyebrow in admiration. As the Western world lurched out of the Georgian era and into the Victorian period, a curious transformation swept through its legal systems. The frilly collars and powdered wigs gave way to stiff, high necklines and severe moral codes that would make even the most puritanical colonial magistrate blush with admiration. The Victorian era, stretching roughly from 1837, with Queen Victoria's coronation to her death in 1901, gave us industrial marvels, literary classics, and some of the most bewilderingly prudish legislation human civilization has ever produced. The Victorians had a particular genius for turning personal moral panic into public policy. Take, for instance, Britain's Obscene Publications Act of 1857, championed by Lord Campbell. This legislation empowered police to seize and destroy any material they deemed obscene, a term left conveniently undefined. The Act's vague wording essentially allowed authorities to criminalize anything that might corrupt those whose minds are open to such immoral influences. In practice, this meant not just pornography, but medical textbooks, information about contraception, and literary works that dared mention bodily functions. One publisher was sentenced to 2 years of hard labor for printing a translation of Zola's novels. You published a book mentioning human reproduction. To the rock quarry with you, sir. This legal prudery extended to the theater, where the Lord Chamberlain's office held absolute censorship power over all public performances. The office could demand changes to scripts for reasons ranging from religious offense to political commentary to language unsuited for the innocent ears of youth. Most bizarrely, their guidelines prohibited the representation of any living person on stage without their express permission, and banned any depiction of God, Christ, or contemporary British royalty. This led to absurd workarounds, such as setting plays about current events in fictional countries thinly disguised versions of real figures. The play isn't about Queen Victoria. You see, it's about Queen Victoria of Ingmark, who coincidentally is also a small woman with a big empire and 9 children. Even artwork fell under the Victorian moral legal hammer. In 1853, police raided an art gallery in London and seized several nude paintings, charging the gallery owner with exhibiting indecent figures for public view. The fact that these were classical-style paintings of mythological subjects from respected artists didn't matter. Bare skin was bare skin in the eyes of Victorian law. The gallery owner's defense that these were serious artworks, not pornography, eventually prevailed, but not before establishing a chilling effect on artistic expression. Yes, Your Honor, I realize Venus is traditionally depicted unclothed, but perhaps she could wear a nice, sensible bathing costume instead. Victorian America was equally enthusiastic about legislating morality, often in even more specific and bizarre ways than their British counterparts. In 1873, Congress passed the Comstock Act, which made it illegal to send obscene, lewd, and/or lascivious materials through the mail. This included not just pornography, but contraceptive information, devices, and medications, as well as any literature about abortion. The law's champion, Anthony Comstock, personally claimed to have destroyed 160 tons of literature and photographs, and to have driven 15 people to suicide through his prosecutions. He considered this last statistic a particular mark of his success. Another immoral bookseller has taken his own life rather than face trial. God's work proceeds apace. Beyond federal legislation, individual American cities and states created a patchwork of increasingly specific and bizarre moral regulations. Boston's Watch and Ward Society, a private organization with significant influence over local law enforcement, created an infamous blacklist of banned books known as the Banned in Boston List. Works by Ernest Hemingway, Upton Sinclair, and Walt Whitman all fell under this legal ban at various points. Getting banned in Boston became such a reliable sales boost in other parts of the country that some publishers would deliberately send their racier titles to Boston first, hoping for a ban that would generate publicity elsewhere. Both American and British Victorians were obsessed with regulating public behavior on Sundays. In Britain, the Lord's Day Observance Act remained in force, prohibiting many forms of entertainment and commerce on Sundays. In New York, the Sunday closing law of 1860 prohibited not just alcohol sales, but nearly all recreational activities on Sundays, down to prohibiting children from playing in public parks. This led to the surreal situation where police would chase children playing ball on Sundays while allowing adult drunkenness and prostitution to flourish on other days of the week. Sorry, son, tossing that ball on the Lord's Day will land you in front of a magistrate, but feel free to come back tomorrow, when your youthful recreation will no longer threaten the moral fabric of society. Perhaps no area received more bizarre Victorian legal attention than bathing and swimming. In the seaside town of Margate, England, local ordinances required men and women to bathe at least 60 feet apart from each other. More bizarrely, female bathers had to use bathing machines, wheeled changing rooms that could be rolled into the water to ensure no male eyes glimpsed an uncovered female ankle. These machines came with a modesty hood that could be lowered at the water-facing end, creating a private swimming area invisible from the shore. To ensure compliance, some beaches employed official dippers, usually older women who would escort female bathers to their machines and ensure proper decorum was maintained. No, madam, you cannot simply walk into the ocean like a common trollop. Please wait while I wheel you in properly. American beach laws were equally obsessive. In 1847, Boston passed an ordinance making it illegal to bathe within the city limits without wearing a suitable bathing garment that covered the body from neck to knees. Swimming during daylight hours was also prohibited to reduce the chance of anyone seeing a body clad in even these restricted bathing costumes. For the safety of public morals, please limit your swimming to the pitch-dark hours when no one can see you, but do wear a full-body wool costume just in case someone does. Atlantic City, New Jersey established the position of beach censor in the 1890s, employing men who would patrol the shoreline with measuring tapes to ensure women's bathing costumes were not too short. If a woman's outfit was found to be more than 6 inches above the knee, she could be fined or even arrested. Men, meanwhile, were legally required to wear tops with their swimming trunks until the 1930s, as a bare male chest was considered obscene. Sorry, ma'am, but according to my official measurements, your bathing costume exposes 6.5 inches of leg. I'm afraid you'll have to come with me to the station. Fashion in general was a prime target for Victorian legal intervention. Multiple American cities passed ordinances against women wearing pants in public. In Paris, women needed a special police permit to dress like a man, and the permit had to be renewed regularly. Even bicycling came under moral scrutiny, with medical and religious authorities warning that women riding bicycles could experience improper stimulation or damage their reproductive organs. Some localities required women to use specially designed female bicycles and prohibited them from riding astride a standard frame. That bicycle has a crossbar, madam. Think of the moral implications. Victorian sexual legislation created some of history's most uncomfortably specific prohibitions. The infamous British Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885 not only recriminalized homosexuality, but expanded the definition of gross indecency between men to include virtually any physical contact or suggestive behavior. The same act raised the age of consent for girls from 13 to 16, a progressive move that was paired with increased penalties for prostitution and morally suspect behavior by young women. This created the bizarre situation where the same legislation could punish both those who exploited young girls and the girls themselves if they were deemed morally corrupted. In America, the purity movement led to equally strange legislative initiatives. Many states passed laws criminalizing not just extramarital sex, but also more specific behaviors. For instance, Indiana made it illegal for a man to propose marriage to a woman while intoxicated, considering it a form of fraud. Michigan outlawed seduction, making it illegal to persuade an unmarried woman to have sex under the promise of marriage if the man had no intention to marry her. One wonders how prosecutors established evidence of the man's original intentions. Could you please tell the court, sir, what your innermost thoughts were at the moment you proposed matrimony? Were you sincere or merely overcome with lustful intentions? Even married couples weren't safe from Victorian legal prudery. The Comstock laws effectively criminalized sending information about sex between husband and wife through the mail. Medical textbooks describing basic reproductive facts were regularly seized and destroyed. Some physicians were prosecuted for writing marriage guides that discussed conjugal relations in even the most clinical terms. Dr. Johnson, you stand accused of sending through the federal mail system a document explaining to married couples how babies are conceived. How do you plead to this heinous charge? Food and drink regulation took on a distinctly moral tone during the Victorian era. While we might associate prohibition with the 1920s, many local prohibition laws were passed during the late Victorian period. Maine enacted the first statewide prohibition law in 1851, creating the template for the bizarre enforcement mechanisms that would later characterize national prohibition. These early temperance laws often included provisions allowing private citizens to destroy alcohol they discovered, creating a legal framework for vigilante raids on establishments suspected of serving liquor. As a deputized temperance enforcer, I have the legal authority to smash this bottle I believe contains whiskey. The fact that it's actually your heart medication is unfortunate, but legally irrelevant. Perhaps the strangest Victorian legal obsession concerned death and mourning practices. While not strictly legislated through criminal law, the social codes around Victorian mourning were so rigid they might as well have been legal requirements. Widows were expected to wear full mourning dress, complete black attire, with no jewelry except jet for a minimum of 2 years. Even children were subjected to elaborate mourning protocols with specific rules about which toys were appropriate for bereaved young ones. Social ostracism for those who failed to observe proper mourning was so severe that it functioned as a de facto legal system. I see Mrs. Henderson is wearing lavender already, and her husband only 6 months in the ground. We are legally obligated to cut her next social gathering. As the Victorian era drew to a close, its legal peculiarities began to seem increasingly absurd, even to contemporaries. The generation coming of age in the 1890s increasingly mocked and challenged the more extreme examples of Victorian prudery codified in law. Oscar Wilde, before his own tragic collision with Victorian legal morality, perfectly captured the era's absurdity. Morality is simply the attitude we adopt towards people whom we personally dislike. In the Victorian legal system, those personal dislikes became public policy to an unprecedented degree. As we leave behind the high-collared, tight-laced world of Victorian legal prudery, with its beach censors, bathing machines, and banned books, we can appreciate how thin the line has always been between personal morality and public legislation. The Victorians showed us that even the most intimate and personal aspects of human behavior could be subjected to legal scrutiny if society became sufficiently convinced of the moral necessity. A lesson worth remembering as we continue our journey through history's oddest laws. Remember how European monarchs fussed over beard taxes and window duties. Their Asian counterparts were playing an entirely different game of arbitrary governance. In China, the legal framework stretching back to the Qin dynasty in 221 BCE operated under a philosophy called legalism, a system that made no pretense about using law as a tool of absolute control rather than justice. The first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, was particularly fond of collective punishment. If one person committed a crime, their entire family, sometimes extending to neighbors, would face execution. Perhaps most bizarrely, he made it illegal to discuss the past or previous dynasties. Imagine being executed for reminiscing about the good old days, a convenient way to ensure nobody could point out that things might have been better before your reign. The Tang dynasty later introduced a legal peculiarity that might sound progressive at first. Officials were required by law to criticize the emperor. Yes, you heard correctly. They established mandatory criticism sessions where court officials had to point out imperial mistakes. The catch: if you criticized too harshly or touched on the wrong issues, you might find yourself executed for insolence. If you didn't criticize enough, you'd be punished for dereliction of duty. Threading that particular needle required political acumen that would make modern diplomats break into a cold sweat. Japan during the Tokugawa shogunate took social control to unprecedented heights with the Sankinkatai system, a policy requiring daimyo regional lords to maintain two residences, one in their home domain and another in Edo, modern Tokyo. These lords were legally obligated to spend alternate years in Edo, essentially holding their families hostage to ensure loyalty to the shogun. The system bankrupted many lords since they had to maintain lavish processions when traveling between their domains and the capital, processions whose minimum size and grandeur were legally mandated. Some lords spent up to half their domain's annual revenue just complying these travel requirements. Korea's Joseon dynasty, meanwhile, enforced one of history's most intricate sumptuary law systems, legal codes dictating who could wear what. The color purple was reserved exclusively for the king. Wearing unauthorized purple could result in a death sentence. Officials were assigned colors and fabrics according to their rank, with punishments for violations ranging from flogging to exile. Even the number of nails you could use in the construction of your house was determined by your social rank. These regulations extended to women's jewelry, tableware designs, and the elaborate hats men wore that indicated their position in society's hierarchy. Speaking of hats, Mongolia under Kublai Khan established laws forbidding the washing of clothing in running water during thunderstorms. The logic: water spirits might be offended by the dirty laundry, causing them to stir up more violent storms. Sensible from a certain mystical perspective, I suppose. But imagine being the judge tasked with determining if someone's laundry had angered a water spirit. India's legal history offers equally perplexing examples. During certain periods in ancient India, it was illegal for members of lower castes to hear Sanskrit verses from the Vedas. If they accidentally overheard these sacred texts, the punishment involved pouring molten lead into their ears, a penalty that rather definitively ensured they wouldn't hear much of anything afterward. A grimly efficient, if horrific, approach to maintaining information hierarchies. In Mughal India, Emperor Akbar, generally considered one of the more enlightened rulers of his era, maintained a legal prohibition against anyone owning elephants without imperial permission. The penalty could be death, as elephants symbolized royal power. Simultaneously, he established laws requiring religious tolerance, absolutely revolutionary for the 16th century, while maintaining bizarre regulations about court etiquette, including specific rules about how many steps backward officials had to take when leaving the imperial presence. The answer was 7, in case you're planning a time-traveling visit to his court. Perhaps the most mind-bending laws came from Imperial China's examination system. For over 1,000 years, China selected government officials through rigorous civil service exams, testing knowledge of Confucian classics. What's weird isn't the examination itself, but the fanatical anti-cheating measures. Candidates were searched before entering examination cells, small, isolated rooms where they would remain for days. If officials discovered a candidate had smuggled in study materials, the punishment could be execution. Some particularly motivated students tattooed miniature texts on their bodies, leading to strip searches before exams. There were documented cases of examinees who died during these multi-day testing sessions, their bodies simply removed while the examinations continued around them. Pass or die trying was apparently more than just a figure of speech. In Siam, modern Thailand, until the 1800s, it was illegal for commoners to gaze directly at the king. If you accidentally caught sight of the royal person, you were expected to prostrate yourself immediately or risk severe punishment. This law created the bizarre situation where people would throw themselves face down on the ground whenever they heard the royal procession approaching. The practical effect was crowds of people deliberately not looking at the very spectacle designed to impress them, a paradox that apparently escaped royal notice for centuries. The Ottoman Empire, straddling Europe and Asia, contributed its own peculiar regulations. Sultan Murad IV, who ruled in the 17th century, became so obsessed with prohibiting coffee, tobacco, and alcohol that he would disguise himself and wander the streets of Constantinople at night. If he caught someone indulging in these banned substances, he would personally execute them on the spot with his sword. History records that he may have executed over 20,000 people during his reign for these crimes. Coffee houses were considered particularly dangerous as hotbeds of sedition and political discussion, a historical precedent for the modern stereotype of the revolutionary plotting in a cafe. As we drift through these imperial corridors of power, notice how often laws served not justice, but the entrenchment of authority. The more elaborate and impossible to fully comply with the legal code became, the more power rested with those who enforced it selectively. It's a pattern we've seen repeated across continents and centuries. Arbitrary laws create dependent subjects. When everyone is technically guilty of something, everyone relies on the mercy of the ruler. Gone are the days when a king might decree that all cats must wear pants, or that no one shall eat mince pies on Christmas. Yes, that was once a real law in Oliver Cromwell's England. Instead, we enter the era of democratically enacted absurdity, where elected officials collectively decide that drinking a beer should land you in prison, or that the length of your bathing suit warrants police intervention. The pinnacle of legislative overreach in modern America began with the ratification of the 18th Amendment in 1919, launching the grand experiment of prohibition. For 13 sobering years, the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol was constitutionally forbidden across the United States. Of course, this didn't stop people from drinking. It just criminalized millions of ordinary citizens overnight. To enforce this moral crusade, the government took the extraordinary step of deliberately poisoning industrial alcohol that they suspected was being diverted to bootleggers. Yes, you heard correctly. The federal government intentionally added deadly chemicals to alcohol supplies, resulting in an estimated 10,000 deaths. Imagine dying because your government decided that poisoning you was preferable to letting you enjoy a cocktail. The enforcement mechanisms of prohibition spawned their own catalog of bizarre legal peculiarities. Federal agents were authorized to shoot unarmed bootleggers on sight. Meanwhile, doctors could prescribe whiskey for medicinal purposes, leading to a surge in mysterious ailments that could only be treated with bourbon. One enterprising rabbi in Cincinnati secured a permit to purchase 100,000 gallons of sacramental wine annually for his congregation of just 100 families. Either his congregants were exceptionally thirsty during religious ceremonies, or someone was bending the law to breaking point. The same moral panic that fueled prohibition extended to bathing attire. In the 1920s, many American cities employed actual beach censors, armed with measuring tape to ensure swimsuits weren't showing too much skin. In Atlantic City, women could be fined if their bathing suits were more than 6 inches above the knee. In Chicago, men were required by law to wear tops with their swimming trunks until 1937. One particularly enthusiastic beach censor, named Adolfo Caruso, patrolled Coney Island, measuring women's bathing suits and issuing tickets, while reporters dubbed him the bathing suit cop. He reportedly issued more than 10,000 citations in his zealous career. Not to be outdone, Honolulu criminalized singing after 11 p.m., apparently to combat the scourge of late-night Hawaiian serenades. In Tennessee, it became illegal to catch fish with a lasso, an oddly specific prohibition suggesting there must have been at least one creative angler who necessitated such legislation. Oregon passed a law making it illegal to test your physical endurance while driving on a highway, effectively outlawing road trips by sleepy college students. Fashion police were quite literal in many jurisdictions. In Carmel, California, a 1963 ordinance prohibited women from wearing high heels over 2 inches without a special permit. The alleged reason: to protect the city from lawsuits resulting from women tripping on irregular pavements. Rather than fix the sidewalks, officials decided it was simpler to regulate footwear. This law remained on the books until 2017, when the mayor discovered it while cleaning out old files and pushed for its repeal. For over 50 years, technically, every woman in high heels was a scofflaw in Carmel. Some 20th century laws targeted specific technological anxieties. In 1931, the state of Nebraska passed a law prohibiting barbers from eating onions between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. The concern wasn't dental hygiene, but customer comfort during close-quarter haircuts in the pre-air conditioning era. Meanwhile, Connecticut long maintained a law that pickles must bounce to be legally considered pickles. This wasn't arbitrary culinary snobbery. Non-bouncing pickles were supposedly too soft, indicating improper fermentation that could cause food poisoning. The Cold War era birthed its own peculiar regulations. In 1957, North Dakota made it illegal to serve beer and pretzels at the same time in any bar or restaurant. The presumed logic was that the saltiness of pretzels would make patrons thirstier, causing them to drink more beer, a dangerous spiral of snack-induced intoxication that apparently required legislative intervention. More ominously, in Vermont, it became illegal to prohibit anyone from installing a clothesline. as energy conservation measures during the energy crisis elevated the humble clothesline to protected status. Perhaps my favorite 20th century legal oddity comes from Quitman, Georgia, where a 1949 law made it illegal to chat on the town's main phone line for more than 5 minutes when someone else was waiting to use it. Violators faced a fine of up to $50, around $570 in today's money. Just imagine the town's lone telephone operator, stopwatch in hand, monitoring conversations for excessive pleasantries. Not all weird 20th century laws were trivial. Some had profound implications while still being fundamentally absurd. Take Oklahoma's 1908 grandfather clauses, which exempted voters from literacy tests if their grandfathers had been eligible to vote before 1866. Since most Black Americans' grandfathers had been enslaved before 1866, this effectively disenfranchised Black voters while appearing racially neutral. The Supreme Court struck down these provisions in 1915, but they exemplify how even the most serious legal matters could be twisted into logical pretzels. California passed a law in 1925 prohibiting the carrying of ice cream cones in your pocket on public streets, allegedly because pickpockets were using the inevitable melt-through to disguise their activities. Officer, I wasn't reaching for that gentleman's wallet. I was just suffering the consequences of pocket-based ice cream storage. I can only imagine how frequently that excuse was deployed before legislators took action. World War II generated its own catalog of strange regulations. In Britain, it became illegal to feed bread to pigeons or seagulls, as grain was needed for the war effort. The British Board of Trade decreed that men's suits could have no more than 3 buttons, no pleats, no turn-ups on trousers, and a maximum of 4 pockets, all to conserve fabric. They even regulated the maximum length of men's shirts. Under these austerity regulations, the British man of 1943 found himself with shorter shirts, fewer pockets, and an enforced, slimmer silhouette, all in the name of defeating Hitler. Meanwhile, in America, the War Production Board banned the manufacture of cuffs on trousers, restricted color choices in clothing, and even regulated the amount of fabric that could be used in women's swimwear. This led to the development of the 2-piece swimsuit and eventually the bikini, an unintended consequence of wartime fabric conservation that would have scandalized those beach censors from just 2 decades earlier. As we drift toward the latter half of the century, the weird laws continue. San Francisco passed an ordinance prohibiting the storage of anything other than automobiles in garages, technically making it illegal to have that dusty treadmill or box of Christmas decorations taking up space next to your car. In Alabama, it became illegal to drive blindfolded, a law that raises more questions than it answers about what prompted such specific legislation. And in Florida, unmarried women who parachuted on Sundays could be jailed, a strangely specific intersection of marital status, extreme sports, and the Sabbath. The beauty of 20th century weird laws is that, unlike their medieval counterparts, many are still technically in force. As you lie there, drifting toward sleep, consider whether you've inadvertently broken some obscure municipal code today. Perhaps you've whistled underwater or eaten an orange in the bathtub, both technically illegal in certain American jurisdictions. The only thing protecting you from the long arm of the law is the blessed obscurity of these regulations and the limited time of enforcement officers who have better things to do than measure the height of your heels or the bounce of your pickles. The journey through legal absurdity doesn't end with the 20th century. Like architectural remnants from bygone eras, strange laws persist in modern legal codes, forgotten, unenforced, but technically still valid. These legislative fossils remind us that once society enshrines a rule, bureaucratic inertia often preserves it long after the conditions that inspired it have vanished. As we explore these enduring legal oddities, you might wonder how many crimes you're committing daily without even realizing it. In Britain, a 1313 statute forbidding members of Parliament from wearing armor in the House remains technically valid. The law made perfect sense during the volatile politics of Edward II's reign, when political disagreements frequently escalated to armed combat. Today, it means your elected representative is breaking a 700-year-old law if they show up for work in full plate mail, a fashion choice that would raise eyebrows for other reasons anyway. Similarly, since 1837, it has been illegal to handle salmon under suspicious circumstances. In the UK, the Law Commission regularly highlights this legislation as ripe for repeal, but salmon handlers with nefarious intentions remain technically subject to prosecution. For centuries, dyeing in the UK Parliament was technically illegal because the building was classified as a royal palace, meaning anyone who died there was entitled to a state funeral. Stories claim that any MP who had the misfortune of expiring on the premises would be hurriedly dragged outside to avoid the procedural complications. While Parliament eventually modified this regulation, it reflects how institutions often find it simpler to work around absurd rules than to formally repeal them. France maintains its own catalogue of bizarre regulations. In Paris, it remains technically illegal to name a pig Napoleon, a law dating back to the early 19th century when insulting the emperor carried severe penalties. While it's unlikely you'll face the guillotine for a porcine naming violation today, the law has never been formally stricken from the books. Similarly, until 2013, women in Paris were technically required to obtain permission from the police prefecture before dressing as men, which specifically included wearing trousers. This law dated from 1800 and was only formally repealed after multiple failed attempts, despite being unenforced for generations. Germany famous for its orderly legal system, isn't immune to legal anachronisms. In Bavaria, it remains technically illegal to run out of gas on the Autobahn. The reasoning is straightforward. A vehicle stranded without fuel creates a dangerous situation that was entirely preventable. The offense is classified as an avoidable obstruction and can result in fines. Similarly, German law still maintains that a pillow is a passive weapon, a classification dating back to an era when suffocation was a more common murder method. This classification means that technically, a pillow fight in Germany could be prosecuted under weapons charges, though German judges display more common sense than to actually enforce this interpretation. Japan has perhaps the most charming obsolete law still on the books. The Edo period Methuselah law made it illegal for men over the age of 60 to smile in public, as showing teeth was considered undignified for elders. While never formally repealed, this law collides spectacularly with Japan's modern emphasis on customer service and politeness. Just imagine the legal conundrum facing elderly convenience store workers, torn between professional courtesy and ancient prohibitions against geriatric grins. In Singapore, failing to flush a public toilet remains a finable offense under legislation dating back to 1968, when the young nation was establishing its reputation for cleanliness and order. While public toilets in Singapore are generally immaculate, first-time visitors are often surprised to learn that forgetting to press that button could technically result in a fine of up to 150 Singapore dollars. Even more bizarrely, it's technically illegal to chew gum in Singapore without a prescription. After years of expensive gum removal from public infrastructure, the country enacted a ban in 1992 that remains in force, though enforcement focuses on importation and distribution rather than personal consumption. Australia contributes its own legal peculiarities to our collection. In Victoria, it remains technically illegal to wear pink hot pants after midday on Sundays. This law originated in the 1940s as part of local decency statutes, but was never repealed despite changing fashion standards. In Western Australia, it's technically illegal to possess more than 50 kg of potatoes unless you're a licensed potato merchant, a remnant of World War II era rationing that survived until 2016, when the Potato Marketing Corporation was finally disbanded. I can only imagine the black market potato dealers who operated in the regulatory twilight, moving their illicit tubers under cover of darkness. The United States, with its federal system and 50 state legislatures, is a veritable treasure trove of obsolete laws. In Alabama, it remains illegal to drive blindfolded, a law that raises more questions than it answers about the historical incidents that prompted such specific legislation. Arizona prohibits housing donkeys in bathtubs, a law dating back to a 1924 incident when a merchant's donkey, which habitually slept in a bathtub, was washed away in a flood. The resulting rescue operation apparently so annoyed local officials that they enacted a preventative ban. Connecticut legally defines pickles as only those cucumbers that bounce when dropped from a height of 1 foot. This law emerged after unscrupulous food vendors sold improperly brined cucumbers in 1948, leading to cases of food poisoning. The resulting regulation established the bounce test as a practical method for inspectors to verify proper fermentation. One Imagery's health inspectors dropping pickles on deli floors as bewildered customers look on. In Devon, Texas, it remains illegal to make furniture while nude. The law specifies no penalty, leaving one to wonder about both the circumstances that inspired this regulation and how officials would handle modern violations. Kentucky prohibits carrying ice cream cones in your back pocket, a law dating back to horse theft prevention, as crafty thieves would allegedly use pocket ice cream to lure away others' horses without technically stealing them. The horse would follow the sweet-pocketed thief home, allowing the thief to claim the animal had simply followed him of its own accord. New York City technically maintains a law prohibiting citizens from flirting in public or throwing a glance of the eye with lascivious intent. This anti-flirtation ordinance dates to the early 20th century, when young men would gather to ogle women entering the workforce in factories and offices. While never enforced in modern times, it theoretically turns Manhattan into a hotbed of criminal romance every Friday night. Perhaps the most absurd enduring law comes from Alabama, where it remains technically illegal to wear a fake mustache that causes laughter in church. This remarkably specific prohibition suggests an incident where worshippers were distracted by particularly amusing facial hair, an early example of disorderly conduct legislation targeting the scourge of satirical grooming choices in sacred spaces. The persistence of these legal relics reveals something important about how societies function. Laws are easy to create, but surprisingly difficult to remove. Legislators rarely receive political credit for cleaning up outdated statutes, while the process consumes time that could be spent on more pressing matters. The result is legal systems clogged with obsolete prohibitions that remain technically enforceable but practically ignored. This accumulation of forgotten laws creates a troubling gray area where selective enforcement becomes possible. When everyone is technically guilty of something, carrying ice cream in improper locations, handling salmon suspiciously, or wearing pink hot pants after Sunday noon, then enforcement becomes discretionary. Throughout history, we've seen how such discretionary power can be weaponized against disfavored groups or individuals, with obscure regulations suddenly enforced when more straightforward charges wouldn't stick. As we approach the end of our journey through legal absurdity, perhaps the most important lesson isn't about the strange laws themselves, but about the society that creates and preserves them. Laws reflect our fears, priorities, and prejudices. They crystallize moments of moral panic and preserve them long after the immediate concerns have faded. From beard taxes to pickle bouncing requirements, each weird regulation offers a window into the anxieties and preoccupations of the society that enacted